Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this WorldOregon webinar on the Iranian protests. We have an excellent presenter here who will be on shortly. Before we jump in, just a few general words from WorldOregon about today's event. Should be familiar for those of you who have joined us before for webinars. Um, Audio and video is only for presenters and WorldOregon staff. Questions from the audience can be raised through the Q&A function of Zoom. We will post in the chat links we may think would be of interest to you related to this and other WorldOregon programs. So again, please post your questions in the chat as we go along. We'll have, as usual, a presentation from our expert, followed by Q&A moderated by Director of Programs, Tim DeRoche, and looking forward to that. Before we dive into today's program, a reminder that we will all be tomorrow. Those of you who can join us at the Portland State University Smith Memorial Student Union for a program on the Ukraine and the future of European security. There's also a Zoom option. I just posted in the chat the link on how to register for that. We have the season tickets or individual tickets. We've had two great decisions talks already so far. One on human rights, international law, and one on nuclear weapons and nuclear security. So I encourage you to join us tomorrow at noon for this talk on the hot topic of Ukraine. We'll be having more coming up in the Great Decision Series. Look at our website for the other topics. And with today, we will continue to add rapid reaction programming to hot topics around the world. And as without further ado, really, I would like to welcome our folks from around the country through the World Affairs Councils of America and hand the mic over to my colleague, Director of Programs, Tim DeRoche, who will introduce our speaker and we'll get this show on the road.
Great. Thank you, Derek. And Robert, it is great to see you. And as we were joking before we came on, we have to stop meeting like this. We have done a number of rapid response programs on Iran over recent years, with the death of the president, with the Women Life Freedom protests breaking out. It seems as though, especially in the West, there is a lot of watching of, could this be the next big one? And I'm very, very interested to get to that very question, which is, how is this different? Why is it different? And where it'll go. But before we get there, for our audience, I want to just introduce our speaker. Robert Asaadi is a professor of political science at Portland Community College and previously taught at Portland State University, and is the author of the book Postrevolutionary Iran, The Leader of the People and the Three Powers, which came out in 2021. It highlights the complexities of Iran, its leaders, and its people. Robert serves as Portland Community College's chair of the Internationalization Steering Committee and is the faculty advisor for the West Coast Model European Union. He holds a doctorate and master's degree in poli-sci from the University of Minnesota, where I also went to school, and a bachelor's in political science from the University of Iowa. And without further ado, I'm gonna toss it back to you, Robert, and the floor is yours.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you, Derek. And thanks everyone for being here, taking some time out of your day in the middle of the week, in the middle of the day, to be here for this talk. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. I have some slides to talk through, and I'll get that set up here. But before I jump in, I guess I would frame this talk. I say here, Iran at a crossroads, protests, repression, and escalation risks. Really, we're gathering now, watching what I would describe as a profound crisis unfolding in Iran for the past 3 weeks, plus the images coming out of Tehran, Shiraz, Mashhad, other cities around the country have been startling to say the least. But the headlines often fail to capture kind of the structural shifts that are happening beneath the surface. And as we were saying before we started with Tim, it's even so interesting how in the last week, kind of media attention on Iran has kind of faded away again. So today, I'd like to look not just at a protest or a moment, and instead try to describe to you what I would describe as a state in a deep legitimacy crisis that's facing a population pushed to the economic brink. So my goal is not to give you a prediction on if or when the regime will fall, but to try to understand this trajectory. Are we headed toward uh, democratization, civil unrest, a new form of authoritarian rule in Iran? So I was reminded of Alexis de Tocqueville's observation, where he once wrote, "In a revolution, as in a novel, the most difficult part to invent is the end." This is a post-revolutionary society, and so rather than aiming to invent the end of the Islamic Revolution, I would instead ask what might lie on the horizon of the foreseeable future. So I'll go ahead and share the slides then. Just go to slideshow. So hopefully you all are seeing those now. So yeah, to kind of frame the question, the kind of central inquiry of this talk that I'm looking forward to speaking with you all about is, are Iran's protests leading toward reform, regime collapse, or some form of continued authoritarianism? Are we seeing a system that maybe is on the brink of opening up in some way in order to preserve its own existence? Is the government on its last legs, or is the system hardening in some way? And it's somewhat of a paradox, and maybe it's a pessimistic assessment, but I would say my interpretation and the scholarly consensus, listening to a lot of talks about Iran and hearing what others have to say, is it seems to be the consensus among experts is that we're witnessing some version of the third option here, that the regime is not collapsing today, nor certainly is it reforming, but instead it's morphing into a more militarized, securitized version of itself. So I'll try to explain that a bit more, and we can certainly speak about it. So just a bit about the context of what is happening December 2025 and into this month. So let's try to reconstruct how we got here. So it wasn't a social issue this time that was the spark, like, for instance, the death of Mahsa Amini in police custody in 2022. This started principally as an economic issue. In late December 2025, the Iranian rial didn't just slide, it collapsed. Prices for medicine and bread, staple commodities, essentially doubled in a 48-hour period. And on December 28th, really the critical date is protests began in the Grand Bazaar of Tehran. So why does this matter? Well, the Bazari class are the traditional merchant class in Iran. They historically were the backbone of the revolution, along with the clerics, and the backbone of the conservative establishment. So when they shut their doors, it means that the state has effectively broken its economic contract with one of its core constituencies. So these are not radical students. These are, in general, of course, like any class, they're internally variegated, but in generally, they're quite conservative. They were the historical financiers of the 1979 revolution itself. So this is a signal that the economy has really ceased to function. Within 48 hours, the protest slogans shifted from things like "fix the rial" to "death to the dictator," and calling for the end of the regime. So this rapid radicalization from issues of the wallet to politics and regime change, I would say, is a defining feature of this wave. The speed is critical. It shows us that the economic grievances in Iran are no longer viewed as like management problems, that instead they're viewed as systemic failures that require the government to go. What was the response? Well, on January 3rd, we saw the no leniency decree by the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, and this changed the rules of engagement for the security forces. Essentially, as I say here, it was a green light for the use of lethal force against protesters. And so it's a shift from riot control to suppression. Shortly after that, the digital blackout began, which you probably read about, effectively 100% internet shutdown. And so what we're seeing, what we have been seeing in the interim period is happening in the dark. And that has been explicitly designed to hide the scale of the state's reaction. So just a bit about where we are now. Like Tim suggested, this isn't the first time that there have been nationwide protests. If we just look in the last 16, 17 years, 4 episodes, including the current one we might highlight. So to kind of try to understand the evolution of how opposition politics has functioned in Iran. There was the so-called Green Movement in 2009 that centered around a disputed election, the re-election of then President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. So this was fundamentally political. It was largely middle class and urban, and the call was for new elections, right? And what did it result in? House arrest of several leaders of the movement, and it was, effectively quelled. Right then, 2017-18, there are economic protests. Again, in 2019, further wave of economic protests, this time centering around fuel prices. A shift here, more working class. It was violent, but relatively brief. Around 1,500 people, by most accounts, killed during this. Economic protests became anti-regime, but they were repressed. 2022, the Woman Life Freedom Movement, which I'm sure many of you remember, social, cultural, led by women, led by young people. The outcome, militarized crackdowns, arrests, executions. And then the current impasse, 2025-26, quite broad coalition, like I mentioned, now including even more conservative classes like the merchants, started by focusing on opposition to high prices, quickly becomes coupled with opposition to the clerical regime itself. And we're in the midst of an ongoing militarized crackdown and kind of the shadow of US or Israeli or other foreign intervention to aid that collapse, basically. So yeah, this in part is why the current impasse is so dangerous to the regime, in that it bridges class divides in the way that previous movements, maybe accepting the Woman Life Freedom Movement, had struggled to do so. So a bit about the legacy of unrest. Why has the movement slowed? I spoke with Tim about scheduling this talk 1 week ago, and things have changed quite a bit in the last week, in part because of the digital wall. The internet shutdowns have presented a big coordination challenge. You can't really organize a 1 million-man march, for example, if you can't communicate about the time and the place. Certainly opposition, movements and protests are still happening. But it's been a big obstacle, definitely for those movements to organize. There has been lethal repression by the state. So the state has been, like I said, very willing to use force, raising the costs of participation, and the security forces essentially have a blank check to do that. So this raises barriers to entry in the protests for, say, the average citizen, and it takes immense bravery to step outside of that. The third point, which I think is really critical, is that this is a leaderless movement, or there's a lack of clear leadership. So the movement is highly decentralized. That has its advantages in some way in terms of not reproducing the same maybe strictly hierarchical system that it's trying to replace, right? Revolutions have a way of kind of swallowing themselves and reproducing the worst excesses of the regimes they're trying to oust. But there is no Mandela, there is no Khomeini, there's no Walesa like figure that have folks have organized around. I'll say a little bit about Reza Pahlavi in a moment. That may be a name you've heard a lot in the context of these. What I'm really describing here is a lack of a centralized leadership in Iran uh, to negotiate with or strategize with. And so the protests, in a sense, remain kind of localized outbursts of rage. They share a lot symbolically, that's true, and in terms of the grievances, but they lack the kind of coordination that other political opposition campaigns have had, and that, in my own field of political science is something that's identified as a great resource for opposition movements. So what's really driving the protests? I think you could describe it as a kind of poly crisis, right? It's not just one thing. Anger is widespread because it is a reflection of multiple government failures converging. There's the economic collapse, which is the engine that, this is in part driven by economic sanctions, which were reimposed on Iran last year. It's economic management by those in government that this has, people in Iran have seen their savings wiped out. And so it's creating an environment where people are increasingly feeling like they have less and less to lose. So in that sense, the cost of protesting feels a bit lower. I'll share a bit more in a moment about some insights we might glean into this from behavioral economics about a field of study called prospect theory. Some of you may have read a book written by Daniel Kahneman, who he won the Nobel Prize for this work in, I think, the early 2000s, but his book was called Thinking Fast and Slow, something like that, I think. It was a pretty popular book in the early 2010s. But the basic insight that he and his co-author Amos Tversky wrote about in behavioral economics was people's behavior if they perceive themselves to be in a domain of loss or in a domain of gain. Are they more risk averse or risk acceptant? And so as people in Iran increasingly perceive themselves to be in a domain of loss, they're becoming more risk acceptant or risk tolerant. So even if protest means a high likelihood of meeting lethal force against you, because of the economic decline and the perception, the referent point that folks increasingly have of being in a domain of loss, they're still willing to do so. Second point, sanctions pressure is still a part of this. We can't ignore the international dimension. Sanctions have stifled the economy. They've also devastated the very middle class that is often needed in leading a democratic transition. And so we can talk more about that. There's also the generational piece here and the kind of generational alienation, which was exacerbated even further through the woman life freedom movement of 22-23. Iran has demographically is a very interesting country in that it has a massive youth bulge, and that Gen Z Iranians are digitally native, they're overwhelmingly secular, and they are decoupled from the ideology of the 1979 revolution. So increasingly, they look at the ruling clerics and see them as kind of figures from a different planet almost. The final piece about political exclusion in the last few election cycles in Iran, the state was quite harsh in disqualifying moderate and reformist candidates. So that effectively tells the population you have no real voice at the ballot box. And so the voice has moved more and more to the street. I think those are all things, and there may be others as well, but some of the big things that help us understand the current impasse. So I'd like to just say a little bit more about this idea of Iran at the tail end of what some have described as a lost decade, 2015 to 2025. The kind of macro view, and I draw some of the data here I'll share with you, is from a very interesting research group at Stanford called the Iran 2040 Project, where they compile a lot of economic and social data all about Iran. And so some of the things which I'll share with you are related to macroeconomic measures like GDP growth. For example, since 2012, Iran has hovered somewhere between 0 or 1% yearly GDP growth, with the economy contracting further, kind of responding to the imposition of multilateral sanctions. It's also during this decade that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, essentially unraveled after the US withdrew from it and Iran began no longer fully complying with its obligations under the deal as well. A big part of the story here is also about inflation. Inflation in this period has persistently hovered around 40%, effectively eroding any nominal wage gains, which I'll say more about in a moment. All of it here to summarize in the impact piece is that the economy, Iran's economy, is smaller in real terms per capita than it was in 2010. So that's maybe the best way to describe the idea of the lost decade. So it means really that the government has no slack. In previous crises, they could dip into oil reserves to subsidize bread or fuel, or try to calm people down through these economic interventions. Today, those reserves are depleted or inaccessible due to sanctions, and so the kind of safety net of state response of rewarding people to maintain loyalty is less present. I'll show you some of the data, and I'm happy to talk about it a bit more. What you see here, and the dates on the bottom on the x-axis are the Iranian calendar. So now it's 1404 in the Persian calendar. In March, it will be the new year, first day of spring to 1405. So just so a sense of what you see here, it's also showing you presidential administrations through the Raisi administration. Ebrahim Raisi was elected in 2021. You may recall that he died in a helicopter crash in 2024. There were snap elections, and in July, the current president, Masoud Pezeshkian, was elected. The next election, presidential election, will be in 2028, scheduled. Pezeshkian, the current president, was a member of parliament for many years. He was also an advisor to the former president, Khatami, who's regarded as kind of the most reform-minded president in post-revolutionary Iran's history. The essential thing here that you see in this graph, so the red line is inflation, the black is monetary base growth rate. We don't have to get too into the weeds in this, but there's a theory in economics called the quantity theory of money, which basically says inflation should be lower than money supply growth, right? Adjusted for real growth. And you want that in order to maintain price stability. So especially when you see the red line ticking above the black line, if the money supply grows faster than the real economy in terms of GDP, essentially more money chases the same goods, which drives prices up. So that is what Iran has been experiencing. And yeah, these are very, very high, in a comparative terms, very high levels of inflation. So that's a huge challenge. The second piece here, just showing it in another way, and again, this is from the Stanford project, Iran 2040. They compare Iran to some other developing economies, China, Turkey, South Korea, and you can see the trajectory, right? From the moment of the Islamic Revolution, real minimum wages fixed to $2020 have flatlined, right? There's not been growth in the last decade, and Iran now is even below real minimum wages than the other countries listed here. So one way of measuring it. The other thing I wanted to mention as well, average GDP growth. So this is putting together a 40-year period, 1980 to 2020. What has been the average percent change per year in GDP growth? And Iran's has been quite anemic, below 2%. How does it compare to UAE, Turkey, Pakistan, Malaysia, other similarly situated developing economies? To say nothing of a case like China or even India, which you can see over the same period, China's average GDP growth was around 9%. Um, okay, so uh, just to say a bit more about the demographics and the idea of the youth bulge, part of the problem is the problem of youth unemployment or underemployment. So if we look folks age 15 to 24, those who are university graduates, 40% plus are experiencing unemployment. So kind of the promise that Iran would benefit from this demographic dividend, that this would help grow their economy, a large workforce should boost the economy. In reality, it's become a liability for the regime. That Iran has a highly educated population, the literacy rates are very high, university graduation rates are very high, especially in engineering and sciences, and even are comparable to many Western nations. But the economy, stifled by sanctions, corruption, mismanagement, can effectively absorb these folks. So, one option is leave the country. Many have done that. The phenomenon of brain drain or exit is a huge challenge. And those who are remaining probably, they can't or don't want to, seek a future elsewhere. So we have millions of highly educated, internet savvy young people chronically underemployed. Physics graduates, for example, driving Snap, which is the Iranian equivalent of Uber, engineers selling goods on the streets. So this, yeah, as I said, it's a huge problem for the state. Maybe I don't need to overstate it, but I think it's an important thing to consider. Another measure that's interesting to look at is home ownership rates. So in both rural and urban areas, these have declined in recent decades. So in Iran, much like in the U.S. or Europe, owning a home is a primary marker of kind of making it. It's the badge of the middle class. It's your security against inflation. And so, to the extent that that dream is becoming less and less likely for young people, the current generation in Iran, which is reflected in the data, uh, this is this is a huge challenge. So, yeah, that there's data that suggests that in Tehran, for example, the largest city, rent now consumes up to 70% of the average household's income. You work all month, 70% of your check is gone the moment you pay your landlord. So you have 30% left for food, transport, education, healthcare, everything else in an economy with 40% inflation. So there's a huge sociological impact to this. And I think it's part of the reason that helps us explain why we see relatively bourgeois neighborhoods in North Tehran, for example, which has historically been quite affluent, joining protests alongside the working class because they've effectively been proletarianized by the economy and how it's developed in recent decades. So, just to go back then to the core question, just to think about the economic grievances, are they leading to reform or a kind of structural collapse? So, like I say here, the structural data suggests that the system lacks the financial resources now to buy loyalty, which leaves one less tool in the toolkit and an increasing reliance on repression as the tool to maintain their position in power. So it's a kind of stark binary in that sense, structural collapse or a kind of total authoritarian consolidation. And it's becoming more and more difficult to kind of see what the middle ground within that looks like. So just to summarize this section about the economic piece, and then next I want to talk about attitudes and basically what can we learn by looking at public opinion data. So the first point about purchasing power, the collapse in purchasing power, I think, is a very strong engine of the current unrest. It is structural. It's not temporary. It's not going away anytime soon, unless there are dramatic changes, both in terms of sanctions and in terms of how the economy is being managed. We're seeing a decline of the middle class, driven by the housing trap and inflation, which has removed the kind of social buffer that usually or has historically protected the regime from radicalization, right? People may be deeply unhappy with the social policies of the regime, but they're concerned about maintaining their property. What would a revolution mean to the bit of status that they've been able to acquire? So I think that's diminished. And in terms of the structure, the shift to a more monolithic rule, I think, is an important piece. So I think this all leads us to the conclusion, or you could argue that we're witnessing a transition of Iran from maybe a kind of hybrid theocracy to a much more securitized military state. So let me shift gears a little bit and say a little bit more about the data that we have in terms of attitudes of the population in response to these conditions. So there is good. There are some outlets of public opinion polling of Iranians. One, which some of you in the audience may be familiar with, from a group called World Values Survey, which has a several hundred question survey that they ask in as many countries around the world as they can, so that they can then kind of try to compare political cultures and attitudes of all countries around the world. Iran was included in the most recent wave of the World Values Survey poll, which was conducted between 2017 and 2022. And so I'll share with you a bit about the findings. The findings there. The Iran study of World Values Survey was conducted in 2020. A population of or a sample of almost 1,500 Iranians, nationally representative, statistically significant sample. There's also some polling firms here that I'll share data with you from their research. One is called Iran Poll. They're based in Toronto. They conduct computer-assisted telephone interviewing of Iranians inside Iran. And the other is called the Group for Analyzing and Measuring Attitudes in Iran. They're based out of the Netherlands, and they conduct polls over social media apps among people in Iran on a whole variety of questions. So I want to, just share some of the findings here. I give you a hint on this slide that what you'll see is really the decline of confidence in government, decline of trust, and that in response, then we can say, well, in that environment, how has the government or how has the state responded? Well, it's responded by increasingly ruling through coercion via the coercive apparatus of the state, the police, the military, the Revolutionary Guard Corps as the core pillar of stability. One thing I wanted to highlight about the appeal of democracy. So there's this really interesting question in World Values Survey on the appeal of having a democratic political system. So the question reads, I'm going to describe various types of political systems and ask what you think about each as a way of governing this country. For each one, would you say it is very good, fairly bad, or very bad as a way of governing this country? And so Iranian respondents in 2020, the way you can compare this is do very good plus fairly good minus fairly bad plus very bad, right? So you get a measure of favorability. And so the Iranian respondents were plus 93% on the good side, right? 59% said very good on democracy, 36% said fairly good. So plus 93 total. You may be interested, the US was also included in this wave, and the US was only plus 67 positive on democracy. Turkey was plus 61. Iraq was only plus 18. The question wasn't even asked in Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia because World Values Survey didn't conduct a survey in those cases. I wanted to just highlight that because there is clearly, and not just in this one survey, but repeatedly, strong demand among the Iranian public for the idea of democracy as a political system to govern the country. Let me show you a bit more from the Iran poll and the Gaman surveys. So this is from an Iran poll report from 2022. And they sketch out from 2015 to 2022, what did Iranians have to say about how good or bad is the country's general economic situation? What you start to notice is around 2018, 2019, things take a turn for the worse, right? So you can see by July of 2022, already more than half of respondents described the economic situation in the country as very bad. What about another question on the economy? Do you think economic conditions in Iran as a whole are getting better or getting worse? Again, by the time we get to July 2022, 65% of respondents said they think the economic conditions are getting worse. There, as you can see, the big shift from May 2015, some hesitant optimism, almost half saying we think it's getting better, down to 28% in July of 2022. From the Gaman data, some interesting questions about political systems. Again, just reinforcing what I shared from World Values Survey. Overwhelmingly, the best assessment was for having a democratic political system. 68% of respondents said that was very good, compared to 19% favoring religious law, 6% favoring or saying very good, having army rule, 20.4% very good, saying having a strong leader who does not have to bother with parliament and elections. This is from a February 2022 survey. Another way they ask the question, which option comes closest to your political orientation? This is from February 2022. And here you can see the kind of recent trajectory. So the highest category of people saying this is closest to my political orientation is a proponent of regime change as a precondition for change. So it is true, and it has been, that many, or a plurality in this case, Iranians are now in a position of not really believing in gradual reform or a kind of structural transformation, but they're saying, in order for our what aligns with my political orientation, regime change as a precondition. So the data is kind of bearing this out. Even another way that Gaman asks it, which is kind of interesting, is what do you think of the following political leaders of Iran's modern history? Highest favorabilities for the former Shahs of Iran, Reza Shah and his son, the last Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. It's very interesting because I'm not aware of data showing this from, say, 10 or 20 years prior to February 2022, but I think the consensus would have been much higher favorabilities for Mossadegh and probably a lower favorability for the former Shahs. But that has definitely shifted, I would say, in the last 10 years. You can see, much lower favorability assessments for Ali Khamenei, the current supreme leader, or even Ayatollah Khomeini. You can compare the data there. The current protest wave, a lot of attention has been on protests in favor of the son of the last Shah, who lives in exile in the United States, Reza Pahlavi. One symbol associated with the monarchy in Iran is the three-colored flag with the lion and sun symbol. And so in February 2022, these respondents to the Gaman survey, again, which are Iranians residing in Iran, when asked which design for Iran's national flag do you prefer, the largest support came for the flag of the monarchy rather than the flag of the Islamic Republic or even the three-color flag without any symbols. So this becomes interesting. How do we interpret this new appeal of monarchism? I think some have argued that it is a thumb in the eye of the current regime. What more critical thing could one say than support for the monarchy, which the Islamic Republic, its whole raison d'etre was the elimination of that. So it may be that. Or is it reflecting a genuine political commitment to the idea of restoration of monarchy? So I think that's an interesting question to consider. In the interest of time, I'll move over this idea of cultural transition. This is drawn largely from the work of Albert Hirschman, a behavioral economist who wrote a very important book in 1970 called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. How do people respond to decline in firms and in states? So he has a whole framework here, and it really opens up, I think, an interesting idea of how the regime responds to opposition protests, that uh, Iranian society has some options in response to the decline, economic decline, legitimacy and public confidence decline in government that they're experiencing, and what I've tried to illustrate through the data I've just gone over. Some may choose exit, some may choose voice, namely protest, some may choose remain loyal to the regime. But based on those choices, then the state also has a choice in how it responds. How does it try to re-legitimate its authority? And in this literature and comparative politics, we sometimes talk about the three R's: reward, repress, or reform. Uh, if the government chooses repression, then citizens again get another choice: exit, voice, or loyalty. And so there's a kind of iteration here that, if we have time at the end, I'm happy to talk through more. But I think we're at a point now where many of those who have chosen exit have already done so. Those who have chosen remain loyal to the regime no matter what have done so. And it is increasingly maybe the people who were kind of on the margins of politics, just trying to live their lives and get by and have some stability for themselves and their families, who are increasingly being pushed into this responsive voice or express protest, right? And certainly there's some parallels with the last year of what's been going on in the United States. And this is a framework that we might use to study any country around the world that's experiencing this kind of crisis of confidence in government. But I'm happy to say more about that if folks are interested in that idea. So just to summarize a bit about, well, what has been the response of the state. The literature on revolutions and political science, one of the strong findings is that revolutions usually succeed if the military splits, if there's some military, defection. We have not yet seen that. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the police have remained unified. In the past, the regime had tried to conceal or maybe diminish some of the use of violence. That's become less prominent now. Even 4 days ago, the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei gave a public address in which he didn't deny that thousands of protesters had been killed, but instead he put the blame on foreign forces meddling in the country, and that these were outside agitators or hooligans or something like this. So there is a kind of logic of or strategic signaling that's, I think, happening here, that by publicly showing the consequences of dissent, the regime is trying to deter kind of those in the gray zone or those in the middle, the millions of Iranians who are unhappy and afraid of joining the active protesters. So it's a strategy for the regime to kind of rule through fear or through, yeah, I think I've said it. So yeah, the state response, coercion as kind of the only option left. For decades, the Islamic Republic survived by using a kind of hybrid strategy. There's an excellent book called Iran Rising by an Australian scholar. Well, he's Iranian, but I think he's at Australian National University. His name's Amin Saikal. The book is called Iran Rising, in which he kind of sketches out this idea of kind of the two-handed approach of coercion and co-optation, or maybe cosmetic kind of reform. If you support the regime, maybe you can get a job in the civil service or a cheap loan or government subsidies. As I've said, the current reality with the stall of the economic engine means that co-optation is less and less on the table. The state is struggling to afford to kind of bribe the population for loyalty. And so instead, what we're seeing is a kind of maximum securitization. if you can't offer carrots, you must use the stick, basically, to put it in simple terms. So the military is being deployed not just to disperse crowds, but to monitor activity in neighborhoods, cities across the country. I think I've gone over that. Just to speak briefly here about the opposition. So, as I said, there is a challenge here, despite the immense economic pressure and anger, the kind of issue or flaw in a sense that the protest movement has in this case, I would argue, is that it is leaderless. In 2009, by contrast, there were leaders inside the country. They were part of the system. They were acting as a bridge between the street and the state. Today, those reformist political figures have been silenced, jailed, completely discredited, under house arrest, imprisoned, and so on. And so that bridge has been eliminated. There's no one inside the system for the protesters to rally behind, in part because of the alienation that especially the younger generation feels toward anyone who had any kind of standing in the regime itself. And so even if the regime wanted to negotiate, it's not clear with whom they would negotiate. Outside Iran, so if not inside Iran, what about outside of Iran? The kind of diaspora opposition, figures like Reza Pahlavi or other activists are very vocal. Indeed, if in the last 3 weeks you watched any news on this, I'm sure you saw many of them in prominent media outlets. So they have a great visibility in social media as well. But they, if you kind of think about the mechanics of a revolution, if you want the oil workers or the bazaar merchants to strike for a month to cripple the regime, right? Someone has to provide for them. And so do opposition figures outside of the country have the organizational roots and kind of financial logistics to support something like a general strike or such an action? So we have a kind of high intensity anger, but low intensity organization. And it's effectively, in the last 3 weeks at least, created a kind of stalemate. And so I think this is a kind of chronic instability. There are flares of violence followed by repression, rather than like a decisive revolutionary moment. And just to say a bit more about Reza Pahlavi, and I want to be mindful of the time as well. I'm kind of trying to wind down here. There is a certain nostalgia factor. Some of the data I showed you reflects that appeal of the lion and sun flag and favorabilities for former monarchs. And you'll hear chants for Reza Shah or in support of monarchy, or see posters of the exiled crown prince, for instance. But I think it's important to kind of have a reality check about all of this. So while there is a high symbolic visibility and there is a certain nostalgia for a better, wealthier, imagined past, that like I've kind of alluded to, the kind of symbolism is not the same as logistics. That Pahlavi does not control the trade unions. He doesn't command the loyalty of military generals. He can't order a national strike. And so I would caution against confusing a protest chant like Javeed Shah with a governing coalition in exile. He's a symbol of rejection of a current system, I think, more than the likely architect of the next one, if indeed there is a change from the current. I'm happy to talk more about foreign pressures effects. How do US or Israeli or other states in the region, how do their actions impact all of this? I think there's strong evidence to suggest that when foreign leaders explicitly call for regime change in Iran or say that they are, quote, protecting protesters, this often backfires. There was a great article written on the axis of evil metaphor, which you might remember from George W. Bush's first State of the Union address in 2002, and the effect that had on Iran's politics. And essentially, it emboldened principlist and conservative politicians and made it very difficult for reformers inside of Iran. Even the 12-day conflict or 12-day war between Israel and Iran over the summer essentially put a lid for a period of time on these opposition sentiments, right? I think that goes some way to help us understand why all of this bubbled up in December rather than, say, June or July, is that there was a kind of rallying around the flag that happened in response to the airstrikes against military targets and others that happened in Iran over the summer, right? It effectively allows hardliners to say, see, these aren't starving citizens, they're agents of foreign intelligence. And in that sense, it securitizes the protests and creates a kind of siege mentality um, among the pro-regime factions. A little bit more about the IRGC and elite politics, and then I'll just wind down. There's so much to cover here, but I think it is accurate to say that the IRGC is the most powerful single institution in Iran. It's not just religious zealots. Really, it's more like a massive business conglomerate and a kind of military industrial complex all rolled into one. Uh, a scenario where, one scenario here is that the IRGC eventually may sideline the clerics and try to preserve the state kind of around itself, or engage in a kind of state inversion focused on preserving its own assets. That is one, I think, possible outcome. It hasn't happened yet. But if the choice comes down to kind of preserve the system or preserve clerical rule, I think it's plausible at least that the IRGC might double down on preserving the system that it has benefited so much from. I had a little bit to share about Venezuela and Iran. Maybe I'll skip over that in the interest of time. The risks of external military action, I think I've talked about. Sanctions, I've talked about. I think prognostication is highly fraught, but if I were to kind of make a prediction or offer you some insights about what is emerging among the scholarly consensus on this about most likely near-term outcomes, I think that a very persuasive argument is that the most likely near-term outcome is a kind of hardliner consolidation that is coexisting with chronic unrest, right? That we're looking now more and more, I think, at a security state model. I think the repression will continue. The economy will continue to limp along. It will benefit from trade relations with China and Russia. Protests, I think, will become a chronic condition. I think there'll be a more and more rapid response talks about the next wave of protests in Iran. I think this is a feature of the system now rather than a bug, given the structural features I've just gone over. The state and the society have become completely divorced in one sense. They're living in two different realities, held together increasingly by force. The final thing, maybe, what does history tell us about all of this? The legitimacy of the state, if not gone, is permanently weakened, I would say. No regime, no government can rule indefinitely without some form of legitimacy, but they can rule for a certain period of time through coercion. Organization beats chaos in some sense. Until the opposition gets organized, the state will have an advantage. And then the final piece about external threats. External threats help dictators, help authoritarian regimes. They validate a kind of fortress mentality. And I think, it's been one kind of stabilizing force for the regime of the kind of saber rattling that's come from the US and elsewhere. So you can tell I skipped over a lot. I have some other ideas maybe that I can share, even going back to my book of how can we understand Iran in a more comparative way. But I'm happy to pause there, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks, Robert. And in the interest of time, I'm going to jump in. I'm going to take a number of our questions and kind of push them together. But you mentioned at the end the question of external threats. And I mean, clearly right now, Iran can neither protect its citizens from external threats, nor are they providing basic needs. So in essence, it almost feels like they're moving toward a cornered, very Assad regime-like approach to what is next. And I want to take a question from the audience here. In view of the fact, and it's a good question because you talked a lot about Gen Zs, but in view of the fact that Iranians over the age of 55 have suffered under both the brutalities of the security apparatus and the Islamic Revolution, how might that affect their ideas on a new government that might follow regime change?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, right? That the maybe some in that demographic might have less nostalgia about the idea of reimposing, monarchy in Iran or something. That's certainly plausible. I guess, the one thing that I think is really clear when we try to trace out what are political attitudes of Iranians in Iran, World Values Survey, Iran Poll Survey, other public opinion barometers, it's actually a pretty clear picture that compared to other states, not only in the Persian Gulf, but in the Middle East, North Africa region in general, like Iranians have very high favorability of democracy in theory and in practice as a political system. So and that crosses demographic consideration like age. Like they want to have a democratic political system. And so the big debate, and if you even go back to like the late 90s and early 2000s was, is the Islamic Republic system sufficiently flexible to accommodate some type of democratization? Or there will be certain kind of right. It won't have civil liberties in the same way that the country like the United States or Germany or wherever else, right? There's certain cultural differences uh, with if you maintain the Islamic Republic framework, right? But is there enough flexibility and room to reform? So I think that had been kind of the main debate concerning Iran, say pre-2022 for at least a decade. And I think the conclusion now is largely in responding negatively to that it's not a matter of like flexibility and the revolution can reinvent itself and a new generation and a kind of Khrushchev moment where a new leader denounces the excesses of Stalinism, let's say, and tries something new. That um, it may be that that's the only path that's available, but I think that's become increasingly less likely. And yeah, I don't think necessarily it's true that 55-year-old plus Iranians are more conservative than young folks or something like that. Yeah, just some reactions to that. I don't know if that answers the question or not, but
So with the shutdown of the internet, there's definitely a sort of desperation to control the narrative. So I'm wondering if you can speak to, is there within Iran, is there, like with China, is there a great firewall of Iran that is that allows for a workaround? And is there any independent media that is able to report within the country on what is happening? And what is the tension there with getting a message out that is not the state's message?
yeah, that's a great question. I think it's very difficult. I mean, there are, news outlets that continue to operate, like Al Jazeera, for example, continue to operate and have folks uh, essentially spokespersons for the government or academics inside Iran who have a very kind of favorable view toward the regime. They were able to continue reporting and expressing their views of what was happening like throughout the crisis and throughout even the internet shutdown. Um, but I think it's almost like you have to read that reporting in a very careful way, where it's like if there's anything in blue ink, don't believe it. And then if you see a report of everything's in blue ink, you kind of approach with caution and try to read between the lines. Um, I've really been struck. I mean, one thing that's been really striking for me in the last 3 weeks is like the amount of false reporting about what's been happening in Iran, or hugely conflicting accounts from folks who are outside of Iran, who are critics of the regime, or folks who are in support of the regime, or a sympathetic media outlet like Al Jazeera, for example. Uh, this huge divergence, I think it remains a big challenge about what's the level of veracity of any reporting we're able to get outside of Iran from human rights groups, or other governments, about what conditions actually are, which I think is why it is so valuable to turn toward these kind of macro measures, like some of which I tried to share today, of like, we do have a sense of the broader trajectory, both in terms of attitudes and, say, economic conditions. And from that, we can draw plausible conclusions, right? And there'll be conflicting reports within that trajectory, but it kind of maybe will hover around a best fit line that analysts are able to draw, based on these kind of broader understandings. But I think it's a huge challenge. And just like isn't it interesting? It echoes again in 2009. Right. In 2009, one of the big headlines of the protests around the Green Movement was we're just now seeing Twitter is being used in a protest movement. It was like one of the first cases where social media was widely used by protesters and by the regime to monitor what protesters were doing. And I think that kind of burst the bubble around a lot of tech optimism that these would be purely like liberatory tools. That preceded the Arab uprisings by a year and a half, right? And when then became Tunisia and Egypt and so on. So I think, something really important about this now, 25, 26 in Iran, about disinformation, AI, false generated images of what's happening, that I think we have to be very cautious about. And yeah, I think that this is something that will be studied in the years coming, about what happened in this case.
So, given Iran's political history, what kind of democratic values and structures are endemic to the culture, and what could we expect should the space open for significant change in its governance going forward?
Yeah, great question. One thing I would highlight, I know World Oregon audiences are prolific readers. There is a long and rich tradition in Iran of kind of liberal, I mean, I would say, yeah, of liberalism. And in fact, there was an excellent book which I reviewed, called Hidden Liberalism: Burdened Visions of Progress in Modern Iran. It was published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. The author is a professor at Indiana University named Hossein Banai, Banai. Again, the book is called Hidden Liberalism. And in it, he traces back, right, the Islamic Revolution in Iran, arguably it wasn't even the most important revolution in Iran's 20th century history. So it goes back to, yeah, thank you, Tim, for putting that in the chat. Goes back to 1905, 1906 constitutional revolution in Iran. So that Iranians in that episode tried to impose meaningful constraints on the monarchy. They demanded and achieved the creation of a parliament, of fundamental laws outlining rights of Iranian citizens, essentially. And so there is a kind of endogenous democratization that has a rich tradition in Iran. It had been used to try to check the power of the shahs, and the Islamic Revolution itself is initially, or at least had the potentiality, or factions within it were understanding themselves as part of that tradition. It became something very different in a cauldron of war with Iraq, and kind of the success of religious fundamentalists in winning out the day of what that vision of the Islamic Republic system would be. But yeah, I think there's no need for outside states or entities to instruct Iranians on how they might reorganize or create a democratic system of their own according to their own traditions and histories. And Banai's book is a great overview of these ideas, and he calls it hidden liberalism because it often had to exist in the peripheries, both under fear of repression by the monarchs, by especially Reza Shah in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and then after the 1953 coup, essentially Iran is in a 25-year kind of holding period where even liberal opposition to the Shah was not met favorably. Um, so yeah, I would share that as one resource that folks might be interested in digging further in.
So just to wrap things up, one final question. You talked a little bit, or actually quite a lot about the disaffected young Iranians leaving the brain drain and these
Hmm.
young people who want to do something and are having to leave to do it. So where are they going? And in light of things like TPS or other things within this country, how does the global community support these young people who are clearly, they are the future? Um,
Hmm.
how do they support them? What countries are really lending, um, kind of supporting the youth ecology of this group of very young and brilliant people?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I had very clear data on destination countries of Iranian students, for example. I don't have off the top of my head, but just, anecdotally, I know there are large Iranian student populations and young professionals in Australia, Canada, UAE, for example. Turkey is another in the region. Turkey is another destination, and various European countries as well. So, I think the U.S. It's kind of, I think, a much less attractive destination, and compared to some of these other cases. And I think, yeah, those countries have benefited a lot from this, these young Iranians trying to find more opportunity, abroad. Many of whom maybe would have preferred to stay, but felt, and many of them, I think, there's the piece here about gender as well, which we didn't really talk about a lot, but the push factor out of the country is certainly there's a gendered component to it as well, where young Iranian women have struggled to find the same degree of opportunity in the country that they might find elsewhere with like labor force participation and breaking into certain career paths. So yeah, I think those would be some of the countries. Um, in the past, the U.S. has benefited from that migration as well. But like I said, I think there's a lot of reasons why young Iranians are choosing to go elsewhere, maybe kind of being forced to do so. It's a big puzzle, right? In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Iranian government instituted a number of pro-natalist policies because they were seeing kind of the end of the Iran-Iraq war. They really wanted to encourage people to have children. And one of the ironies is that many of those folks who had larger families now 25 plus years later are seeing that, like I mentioned, the government of Iran is not uh, getting a dividend from that investment. Instead, they're seeing those folks go elsewhere or increasingly rise up against the regime. So yeah, I think it's definitely something to continue to follow.
Well, Robert, always great to have you join us and provide, just rich perspective and dimension to an issue that is hard to sometimes get information on. And while the issue itself may have cooled in the headlines within the U.S., that does not mean it is an issue that has gone away. And I encourage all of you to, keep your eyes on things that are below the fold and go beyond the crawl of your CNN screen, and because this is it's an evolving issue, it's a human issue, it's a heartbreaking issue. There are certainly many people in our own community here in Portland and Oregon who have ties to the region, and it is really wonderful to have your insight to help us keep the human dimension in front and center. And I'm going to turn it back over to Derek.
Thanks again, Robert, for the fantastic presentation and discussion. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all the questions, but lots of great ones. Again, we posted some more things in the chat. I urge you to check out. And we didn't talk much in detail, but there's a great podcast called The Rest is History that just happens to be doing a four-part series. It's two British historians about the 1979 Islamic Revolution. It's very interesting as background for all of this. Also, hope that many of you will join us tomorrow, either at Portland State or online for our 12 noon Great Decisions program on Ukraine and the future of European security. So with that, thanks for those who joined us locally, joined us around the country. Thank you to Robert and PCC, and we will see you at a future webinar.